more people coming in, but I'd like to welcome everybody back from a long summer. Hope everybody had a good summer. No, not a good summer? Come on. I know some of you went to great places and did great things. Of course, I know some of you were in classes this summer, so I guess it wasn't so great for some of you. But welcome back. This is our first of our regular weekly Thursday lunches, and we're very happy to have two very distinguished scholar practitioners here with us today. Ilan Goldenberg and Paul Scharre from the Center for New American Security, and they're going to talk about, of course, you've seen their report out there on ISIS, and of course, setting the next president's agenda, one of the themes for the Center for New American Security. We're very fortunate to have with us two people with a vast range of experience. You know, they only look like they're 20 years old, but you know, Ilan has worked at in multiple capacities. You know, including a team supporting Secretary Kerry on many different issues: Iran, Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and a senior staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, among many other things at OSD and state. And Paul has also worked for the Office of Secretary of Defense, has worked on, and you've probably read many of his papers on unmanned systems, autonomous systems. Has worked on the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. I remember that one from 2010 there. And I got to talk to you about some of those issues there, especially the 600 soft teams. But they bring together a wealth of experience, and we're very fortunate to have them for our first seminar this semester, because I think what even though I haven't heard them speak on this topic, I'm pretty sure that this could lay out a foundation for discussions throughout many of your classes for the rest of the semester, because obviously ISIS, Syria, Iraq is not only in the news, it's critically important, and going into this election and what happens next, the ideas and information that they put forth here, I think will set the stage for discussions for the rest of your semester, probably next year, and maybe we'll get them back next year and they can say, "I told you so," on everything. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today and providing us with your insights and expertise.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
So I'll get started, and we're just going to sort of go back and forth on this. The report that we put out in this presentation, basically a strategy for our next administration on ISIS, was the culmination of a year-long effort that we put together through a task force with a number of different senior officials, former government officials, Middle East experts, former military officials, people like David Petraeus and Ryan Crocker. The chairs of the task force was a woman named Michelle Flournoy, who runs CNAS. She is the CEO of CNAS, and Richard Fontaine, who is the president of the CNAS. Though the opinions here and the ultimate ideas, Paul and I were the authors along with the third co-author, so the details of the report are ours, but the ideas very much reflect this discussion. And just important to give you guys a little bit of context, so I think people here will find it interesting. This as you come into a presidential transition, is probably the best year in Washington to be at a think tank, because in year 1 and 2 of an administration, and I actually worked very early in the Obama administration as a political appointee, you still have fresh ideas. A lot of the things, you have a whole bunch of new people coming into government. The ideas that they're going to execute and implement are probably things that they picked up outside of government when they were thinking about going back into government. During that first year. Once you get 2 or 3 years into an administration pretty much decides it knows better than anybody on the outside, and the ability to influence through that process becomes much more limited and difficult. So this, for us, is a moment. I mean, this report was, it's about the Obama administration and trying to influence policymakers today. We put it out in June. But it really is about trying to set the table for what happens come January of 2017. The other thing I'll just say is some of the maps and stats we have here are 2 months old, and given how dynamic the situation is, some of these things have changed. So we'll explain it as we, what has changed as we go through this. But that's the general approach. I'll just warn you about that in advance. So where do we stand? 15 years after 9/11, and next week is the 15-year anniversary, and we're still dealing with essentially the same problem. We're still dealing with a safe haven and a proto-state in the middle of the Middle East that extremists can use to launch attacks against the United States and globally, and can also use to inspire Islamic radicalism across the globe, basically using it as a recruitment tool to pick up other affiliates. This territory, and we had this before in Afghanistan right after 9/11, we've had this in Iraq, we've had this all over. It's still a challenge we're trying to figure out how to deal with as a US government. But this territory that ISIS now holds, and ISIS held, this is at its peak in August of 2014, it's ultimately the center of gravity for ISIS's capacity to launch attacks globally. If you want to over time reduce and eliminate the ability of ISIS to carry attacks anywhere, you have to work with, the United States, working with partners, has to essentially eliminate this ISIS-held territory, and importantly, replace it with something that is actually sustainable in the long term. Because we've already fought this fight once. We fought this fight in 2006 through 2008 through the Anbar Awakening, where we took a lot of this territory and put in place forces that were more acceptable to us. And then it all collapsed and we're back here. And part of it is because we never really addressed the underlying challenges. And so the question is, can you actually have a sustainable solution that over time eliminates these safe havens and can hopefully apply beyond, not just here, but also globally. The other last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Paul for some comments. As we started to look at this challenge, we really thought about it as two separate theaters of conflict. What you've got here is, and it's not based on Iraq and Syria. What you've got here in gray is the first theater of conflict. They call it ISIStan. You're going to have to eliminate who holds this territory, and then you're going to have to replace it with something acceptable. Then separately, you have this whole theater of conflict in western Syria, which is a Syrian Civil War that's now been going on for 5 years, and is creating security vacuums and conditions that then created ISIS in the first place, and could also create other extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other safe havens that can also be used to launch strikes against the United States. So you have to deal with that challenge as well. It's even a more complex challenge over there, but you really can't look at these two things in isolation if you actually want to handle this problem.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what the administration has been doing and then places where we think we should see some refinements or changes. Not necessarily a radical shift, but some places where we could improve on the current approach. I want to be clear, though, the current approach is making progress against ISIS. So this map shows ISIS at its peak 2 years ago in the summer of 2014. This is ISIS today. And so you see they've lost a significant amount of ground, or at least as of June. They've continued to lose ground in northern Syria on the mandate offensive. So this approach is making progress, what we've been doing so far. Now, here's the problem. This ISIS proto-state is embedded in this really messy, multi-sided sectarian conflicts in Iraq and Syria. And the approach we've been using so far has relied predominantly on two kinds of groups on the ground that we're supporting. The first in Iraq is the Shia-dominated central government in Baghdad and associated Shia militias to push back ISIS in orange here. And the second is in northern Iraq and in northern Syria, predominantly Kurdish forces. They're a mix of different groups, the Kurdish regional government in dark blue in Iraq, and predominantly the YPG in northern Syria. Now, the problem with this approach is that there are limits to how far these groups can expand into traditional Sunni Arab areas without exacerbating tensions on the ground in these sectarian conflicts. We see this most immediately now in northern Syria with the Turkish offensive that is prompted precisely because of advances by the Kurdish YPG in northern Syria into predominantly non-Kurdish areas. But we've also seen this play out in Iraq. In the Fallujah offensive earlier this summer, there were reports of Shia militias on the outskirts of Fallujah abducting and murdering Sunni men. This is a significant problem in Iraq as we start to see these Shia militias participating in these offensives, either immediately or in the outskirts, the aftermath of them. And there's a risk that they further drive Sunni Iraqis into the arms of ISIS or other extremist groups. So in the short term, maybe retaking ground, but in the long term, even further pouring gasoline on these sectarian conflicts. So I think at the strategic level, what we'd suggest is that the problem today is we've been focused entirely on displacing ISIS, and now enough on who replaces them. Who's going to control Fallujah or Mosul or Raqqa or Manbij? Who controls these areas? And how we're building up sustainable security and governance structures. And what we would propose is that we make sure the United States is using a bottom-up approach where we're supporting local groups on the ground that are acceptable to the population in those areas. And so that we're not using non-local groups that maybe further exacerbate these tensions in the region.
So Paul was talking about the core problems in that first theater of conflict, ISIS stand. Talk a little bit about the challenge in terms of our policy in the second theater of conflict, which is even more complex. You've got the Assad regime in red, more, I'd say, acceptable opposition groups in green. I like the term acceptable as opposed to moderate, because these are groups that basically just need to be acceptable to our interests, i.e. not interested in striking the United States or externally outside of Syria. You've got ISIS, you've got the Kurds in light blue, and you've also got right here, we can call this like the Al-Qaeda tumor. Area that's controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra. They now have renamed themselves, but really a Syrian Al-Qaeda affiliate, which could be just as problematic down the road as ISIS. And importantly, this might be geographically a smaller piece of territory, but this is really traditional old Syria, and this is where most of the Syrian population is. Right? Aleppo right here, and Damascus are the two most important cities in Syria. So we have a large population pockets being controlled by these groups. And the approach that the U.S. administration has taken to date is we're going to try to negotiate an agreement with the Russians. We're going to try to bring everybody in and try to get some kind of a peace deal. But we don't want to get involved in this conflict. It was actually amazing. I saw a briefing just a couple weeks ago from a very senior administration official responsible for the ISIS fight. And they had a map not that dissimilar to this. And this whole area was just in white. We just didn't even talk about it. And you can't have, I think, a policy, that doesn't actually address this question as well. Because at the core of it, these conflicts are not about ISIS. What they are about is security and governance vacuums. These vacuums get created. They then create opportunity for extremists and bad groups to come in. And so you have to solve that core underlying problem. ISIS is simply the disease that sort of comes from it, or the symptom. But the real disease is this core security vacuums. I lost my train of thought for half a second there. But and so you need to just think about how you're going to actually address basically that challenge, as opposed to thinking solely about how you're going to focus just eliminating ISIS. And you need to really, I guess I would say, is we need to think about who we're for, who's going to actually control this territory, not just who we're against and who we're going to destroy. Are we against Assad? Are we against ISIS? That matters less. What matters is who's going to actually hold and govern these various chunks of territory and ensure that they don't become threats to the US or Europe or others.
So what we're going to do now is we'll walk through kind of the overall outlines of our strategy, and then we'll go region by region, talk about different parts of Syria and Iraq, kind of how this would play out. There's four main lines of effort that we would suggest in a modified approach to what the administration is currently doing. So the first one is increasing support to local opposition groups on the ground that are these groups that are acceptable to U.S. interests and acceptable to the local population. So it plays out in a couple ways differently than what we're doing. One, it's increased support to Sunni Arab groups in both Iraq and Syria in this sort of ISIS stand, so that we're not exacerbating tensions by having Shia and Kurdish groups begin to take more of these Sunni Arab areas. So increased support to those groups. Within Syria, in the civil war, it means a shift away from trying to sort of say that we're only going to be for groups that are just fighting ISIS and not against Assad. As Ilan said, it's about who we're for, less who we're against. So accepting that we'll be supporting groups that are fighting ISIS and also fighting Assad. But we're working towards more acceptable opposition groups and building up their capacity. The second line of effort is increased military support to various actors. We certainly have U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq and a small number in Syria supporting some of these groups. What we've been looking at is basically in terms of increasing the range of groups we support. There've been more groups, more U.S. advisors, more enabling support in the form of close air support, intelligence, and other sort of enablers to help them. Looking at potentially embedding combat advisors more closely along with these groups. So far to date, we've held them back from frontline combat operations, allowing them to actually accompany them if that makes sense tactically. And then in Syria, a willingness to pursue more aggressive raids when appropriate against ISIS targets. We've done some of that to date, but we've largely let this, we've sort of treated this border as a barrier to operations in Syria, which certainly ISIS does not do. And so we'd say more aggressive direct action raids in Syria against ISIS targets when appropriate.
So, and I'm just going to add one point on what Paul was talking about before I move on to the third line of effort. In terms of supporting local opposition groups, there's a lot of skepticism for that. Arguments that there are no moderates or you don't really know who to work with. We've actually, the interesting thing is, over the last 5 years, had some examples of success that I think you can take and build and model on. So right here, in the Southwest, we have a group called the Southern Front. 3 years ago, this would have all been yellow or gray. What we did is, through a program with the Jordanians, basically started to arm specific groups on the ground, encourage these different very local groups to come together into larger regional organizations, controlled the border so that others weren't, they were the ones getting most of the weapons, and others that they were competing against who might have been more extreme weren't. We're patient with them, even in some cases where they deconflicted and coordinated for survival with groups like Al-Qaeda affiliates, knowing that we continue to support them even in that scenario. And over time, they became the most powerful dominant groups in that area, and also ended up displacing a lot of the extremists, even turning against some of their old Al-Qaeda allies. And this is also the type of approach we've used with the Kurds in the northeast over there in the light blue, and the approach we used during the Anbar Awakening. So the idea that you can't do this and that there are no moderates to work with, it's difficult, it takes a long time. We've made a lot of mistakes, but if you actually use forces on the ground, instead of trying to bring people in from the outside, and if you actually take a patient approach, tries to unify them, we have some records of success on this.
To be clear, like this argument, which we've been hearing for now 2 years from this administration and others about there are no groups to work with on the ground, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Counterfactuals are very hard in the real world, but the more that you don't support groups, the more that they're weakened, the more that people are pushed towards more extremist groups where they have the support, they have the weapons, they have the money, or weaker, less extremist actors have to work with extremists just to survive on the battlefield. So, what the U.S. does affect the behavior of folks on the ground and also the capacity of these groups.
So the third line of effort, outside of supporting groups, increasing direct military support for them. Third line of effort is then getting the external actors on board, meaning Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, Russia, others. If you take, the first thing you need to do, and this is going to be complicated and take time, but if you are investing more in the conflict than we are today, and taking the types of steps we described, you're going to have more leverage with your partners, especially the Turks and the Saudis, to get them on the same page. And what you want them to do is, most importantly, control their borders and coordinate with you on which groups they are arming and supporting and which groups they aren't. To date, since we haven't been that engaged and haven't been that effective at that, you had essentially an arming free-for-all. Everybody arms their favorite group, everybody fights against each other, the situation just becomes more extreme. A lot of extremist groups end up being empowered by this. And two, you have this border situation right here, which we've been talking a lot about in the last few days in the news, which has become, around the Manbij pocket, the only major supply line in for ISIS. Compare that to the south, where things have been much better. It's because we've had close coordination with the Jordanians, and we've been able to essentially shut this down. So the idea is, if you invest more, you can get your partners then to be more compliant with your approach. And we'll come back, we'll talk in a little more detail about these things, specifically what to do about Turkey. Then on top of that, you can then use that leverage also with countries like Russia and Iran. You aren't going to get them to give up their core interests, nor should you. But you can get them to make some changes in their approaches if they perceive that the United States is more engaged and settle on an agreement. You're never going to get the Russians to give up on Assad altogether. They're too afraid that if Assad leaves quickly, all this red collapses into chaos, more extremists, more problems. They're interested in keeping their naval base out here in Tartus. But you might be able to get them to a place where you can deconflict or get Assad to pull back from this area in the north and allow the United States with its partners to start to really take that territory, just as an example. Then the fourth line of effort is trying to get to a political arrangement in the long term. What this means is, you can't get there today, but you arm more groups, you have them over time take more territory, you give them the support you need, you get the external actors on board. Over time, this map starts to look better and better. There's less gray, there's less yellow, things become more coherent. And you continue to push for the diplomatic negotiations that are ongoing now and try to get to political agreements. Basically, what you'd be looking at is hopefully keeping Iraq and Syria whole through some kind of a decentralized system where most of the power is devolved out and is reflective of the security situation on the ground where these different groups control security on the ground. You might never even be able to get there. Iraq and Syria might break apart altogether. But if you had a choice between Iraq and Syria breaking apart altogether but having acceptable groups controlling territory on the ground and eliminating terrorist safe havens, or having these two countries stay together artificially, I take option A over option B. So even if you never get to that political agreement, I think everything else we're arguing for in the strategy can still hold.
So what we're going to do now is kind of we'll walk region by region, talk through some specifics and ways this strategy would play out, how it would be different from what's already going on. In Western Iraq, we've seen the Iraqi government retake slowly over the last 2 years a number of cities that ISIS had taken in the summer of 2014. Fallujah earlier this summer, and then there's talk of a Mosul offensive sometime this year. One of the things that is concerning about the approach so far is relied heavily on Shia militias. Now in Fallujah, they kept them out of the city proper and had Iraqi forces in the city proper, but they were still in the outskirts where they were reportedly murdering Sunnis. Additionally, the Iraqi government has done just a very poor job of dealing with displaced Sunni civilians. When this happened in the Fallujah offensive, there's very little support for them. So what we'd suggest is certainly pulling back on the Shia militias, and in particular more support to Sunni Arab groups in Iraq. Now, there had been talk of a Sunni National Guard force. There was a law that was sort of teed up to the Iraqi parliament. That's not going to happen. Everything we've heard from folks in Iraq, Americans and Iraqis, is that law's dead. There are potentially ways that the Iraqi government, if the U.S. pushed them, could go through prime minister action to create some of these groups and support them, the same way they have with some of these popular mobilization units, the Shia militias, that have now been sort of fallen under the government umbrella. I think one of the challenging conversations to have, and we ought to be thinking about as a government, is if we cannot get there with the Iraqi government, is that a step the U.S. is willing to take directly to support Sunni Arab groups? Much in the same way that we're doing, frankly, with the Kurds in the north, with the knowledge of the Iraqi government, but we're doing it in any case. There are a lot of concerns with that. Currently, with the current government, there's a risk that you end up destabilizing a body and you get something even more sectarian replacing him. That would be not a good thing. We want to try to avoid that. But I think it's something that we really ought to be on the table for a conversation. If you got a more sectarian government in a body's place in Iraq, there may be a place where you decide you want to take that action. Because in the long run, if we don't have security forces that can cover these territories that are Sunni forces, whether it's ISIS or some other group, we're going to see the return of this 2-3 years down the road. That's what we saw after Al-Qaeda in Iraq was pushed out. There was this power vacuum here in Western Iraq. And the key question is not pushing back Iraq, it's what fills in its role, what takes the place of that power vacuum. Similarly with Mosul, the current approach, which is one of really strategic patience, waiting to do it right, I think makes a ton of sense. The key questions of Mosul are not, it's not really about solely retaking the city, right? We could send in the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, we could retake the city. The question is what happens afterwards? Who's going to control that city? And so getting the right mix of Iraqi government forces, Kurdish forces, together to do this in a way that starts thinking ahead about what's happening the day after we take the city is really, really essential. And having a plan for displaced civilians. Mosul was a huge city. There's something like 2.5 million before ISIS came in. A number of civilians have left, but people still estimate on the orders of hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million civilians could be displaced in the Mosul offensive, which is something that we need to plan for. So one of the things here would be starting to work now with the Iraqi government in terms of building out, with US support and US dollars, security forces to, ideally through the Iraqi government, to secure these areas, thinking about what comes next afterwards in cities we have taken and places we're going to. And if we're reaching an impasse and we can't get there, thinking about going on our own. Now, we see a similar problem in eastern Syria. Western Syria is more complicated. In eastern Syria, where much of the gains are coming from these Kurdish groups in the north. Now, unlike in the north along the Turkish border, where you have an external actor like Turkey that can intervene as these Kurdish groups push into Arab territories, we don't have that in eastern Syria, but it's still a problem, and there's limits to how far these groups can push south. We need to be able to retake, I mean, there's not much here, it's a lot of empty desert, but there are cities, there are tribes along this stretch. We need to be able to retake these territories. There's a group in the south here on the border called the New Syrian Army that is an Arab group that has a pocket of territory, and the U.S. has been pretty lukewarm in its support for them so far. There was an incident earlier this summer where they went to retake an ISIS stronghold several hours from where they have. They were counting on U.S. air support. U.S. commanders pulled off the air support at the last minute to attack a convoy of ISIS troops in Iraq. That was, to them, sort of a juicy target. There were a bunch of ISIS fighters that had concentrated in a large convoy on the road. I don't know why, frankly, 2 years into the war they would be dumb enough to do that. And the U.S. diverted their planes to attack them. This is, I think, a great example of one of the places where our approach would differ from the administration's. And that if you're focused solely on killing ISIS, if you think we can sort of kill our way out of this, which I don't think is realistic. ISIS has tens of thousands of fighters. We need to be thinking about security and governance in these spaces afterwards. But if you're thinking about just solely killing ISIS, the administration's approach makes sense, what they did. If you're thinking about building up these local groups, then it's short-sighted. And this New Syrian Army group ended up losing the offensive they were in. They got pushed back. So we would advocate more support for that group and other groups, Syrian tribes within these areas, and we can start to reach out to them, flip them against ISIS, put in U.S. advisors, and then back them with U.S. support like air power when necessary. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the military component of this. So in both places, there are a couple things that we would recommend doing differently. One is more advisors. Right now, we've had a cap of 300 advisors in Syria. Not sure that necessarily makes sense. So support to more groups, potentially more advisors, allowing them to accompany these units on frontline combat operations. So far, we've held them back. I'm not sure, frankly, what the logic on the military logic of that is on the ground. Politically, it allows the administration to say, well, there aren't combat troops in Iraq and Syria. Reality is, these folks are in combat. We've lost people in the last 2 years. It's certainly, we shouldn't be in a position where we have U.S. troops owning territory. That shouldn't be their role. But advisors are going to be in a combat advising role where they're partnering with forces and they're in dangerous operations. We should be realistic ourselves and with the American people about what we're doing. And so if it makes sense, we should allow our advisors to accompany them in combat operations. In order to do this, we need more authorities for operations inside eastern Syria. Western Syria is different when you sort of get into the civil war conflicts, but in eastern Syria, where it's really just ISIS, it doesn't make sense to allow the border to constrain our operations. This is going to probably require more troops in both Iraq and Syria. We've got 300 in Syria, about 4,000 or 5,000 or so in Iraq. This would require probably several thousand more across the region, possibly maximum on a scale of sort of 10 to 20,000 when you look at supporting troops in the form of medical support, close air support, intelligence, and other enablers. This would not entail a return to sort of large numbers of US ground troops owning territory the same way you had during the occupation of Iraq. We're not talking about 100, 150,000 troops. And the sort of real bright line in terms of US military operations would be not having US troops controlling territory, not having them walking the streets of Mosul patrolling it. That's not their role.
So, moving to southwest Syria, I started talking about this a little bit earlier. We have here the Southern Front, a group that's actually been quite successful for the reasons I talked about in the last year and a half. It's funny, this has all been a CIA-directed program that's all over the front pages of the New York Times, but you can't actually get American officials to necessarily talk too much about it. But an example of what we can do. Now, the biggest problem the Southern Front has had, despite its success, is that it still has no air support. And so, basically, the Assad regime's strategy now in the south and in the north has become, well, if I can't own territory, I'm going to make sure you can't actually begin to replace me and govern instead. And so what the Assad regime has been doing is dropping barrel bombs, airstrikes, terrorizing local civilian populations. They're not trying to retake the territory, they're just trying to make it impossible for any alternative form of governance to take hold, which then only creates further exacerbates these vacuums and creates situations that are problematic in the long term for American interests, because these are the types of situations from which the extremist strongholds can form. The good news, at least in the south, is that since there's an agreement between Russia and the United States and the cessation of hostilities about, I think it was in March of this year, the fighting has essentially stopped in the south. In the north, the cessation of hostilities has not really worked. But what we would argue for in the south, and it's more applicable in the north, it's an important concept that we've put on the table, is if we start getting into a position where American-supported forces are being bombed here, what you say to the Russians and to the Assad regime is you essentially try to implement what we call a no-bombing zone. It's not a no-fly zone. It's not a safe haven. It's a no-bombing zone. And what it says is, if you hit our people in this geographic territory, if you hit this geographic territory with airstrikes, we will hit the Assad regime. You can use standoff weapons to hit the Assad regime, i.e. missiles, if you have to. And so you don't have to take out all of Syria's air defenses, which is the big concern with any kind of escalation of conflict with the Assad regime. There's also concern about escalation with the Russians, but the message to the Russians is, if you hit our people, we will hit your people. Or our proxies, we will hit your proxies. Not if you hit our proxies, we will hit you. And the purpose really is to deter airstrikes in this area. And you can apply this concept in the Northwest as well. We can get into more details if people have questions about that, because it's controversial and it's one that requires a lot of thinking through. But there's two benefits. One, if you actually want groups to begin to govern and hold territory in a credible way, you have to do this. You have to give them the space to then advance. And two is it also sends a signal to the Russians, to the Iranians, to the Turks, the Saudis, everyone, that the US is willing to get more engaged, which then gives you leverage in various negotiations you're trying to have to put an end to the conflict. Moving up to the Northwest, which is probably, this is the most complicated area in the entire conflict. What you've got here is the biggest challenge is you've got what we call this, Al-Qaeda tumor. I mean, you have these moderate groups, then all marbled up with extremist groups that really are working together for survival against the Assad regime and the Russians. I'm not 100% sure. I think things in Aleppo have changed. The Assad regime has been able to pull up to some extent and try to encircle this area. Over the last couple months, there's been intense fighting there. But the bottom line is, this is going to be really hard. The only thing we think makes sense here is to actually pick moderate groups on the ground and continue to support them, or acceptable groups and continue to support them, even if they are working with extremists in the short term, trying to empower them, trying to cut off support for extremists so that over time you can have a replay of what happened in the South, where these more extreme groups become marginalized. It's going to be much more difficult. There are some groups out there, we can get into details on, that the U.S. has supported thus far. Now, and so that would be really the only approach, and then also finding ways to help these groups govern by supporting things like local municipal councils and local governance, and providing the type of aid that the U.S. is able to provide. Basically have these more moderate groups outgovern the Sharia court system that's being used by extremists in that part of the country to provide governance. Finally, moving over to the Manbij pocket, which is also part of the Northwest. The other key to this whole area is trying to cut off the supply lines, trying to cut off this border. We've been trying to get the Turks to do this for a couple of years. Now this is where you've seen the latest news. What happened was, and I'm not sure if this is the Euphrates or not. I think we really should have had the Euphrates on this map. We didn't. But basically, for the last year or so, the Kurds have gone up to the line of the Euphrates, have not crossed the Euphrates. It's been a red line for the Turks, who fear that if the Kurds get all the way across here, they can create their own state right on Turkey's southern border. And in June, we managed to launch an offensive supporting Kurdish groups that started to take the city of Manbij. And over time, the plan is to, again, cut off this piece. If you do, ISIS is completely surrounded. It has no way to supply out, has no way to move in weapons and various fighters. We've been trying to get the Turks for a couple of years to actually come down and seal this border. Well, lo and behold, finally the Turks decided to do it last week. Basically, it was a combination of a most recent terrorist attack in Gaziantep, a bombing at a wedding, combined with, I think, to some extent, fears that the Kurds were going to take this whole territory if the Turks weren't going to take it. And so the Turks decided we're going to launch this offensive and try to seal up this area. For us, that's great. It's exactly what we've wanted the Turks to do for 2 years. Problem is, we didn't really coordinate. They didn't wait to coordinate with us. We were slow in responding to their requests when they decided they wanted to do this. And the Kurds, who we promised the Turks when they launched this offensive would eventually move back beyond the Euphrates, haven't. Surprise, surprise. And so now the Turks and the Kurds are fighting each other, two different armed groups that are the United States supports. And this is, again, if you were looking at our approach, and this is something we presented, the Manbij offensive was just starting when we first presented this in June. And we were very skeptical about the Manbij offensive because the Kurds are never going to be able to hold this territory, so why use them? Why prematurely go and try to cut this off if you want to kill ISIS? I get it. But on the other hand, by doing that, you've now created a mess where if you'd been more patient, you might have been able to get the Turks to come in and just do this, which would have been a lot cleaner, kept the Kurds away from it. Though you could also argue, it's more complicated than that, because you could also argue that if the Kurds had not taken Manbij, the Turks would never have gotten so nervous that they would have actually gotten it. So it's a really complicated balancing act that sort of makes your head spin, but it's a good example of how you need to get the external actors on board if you're going to make any of this work. So with that, I think that we can talk a little bit about the risks and sum up. And
yeah, I think we'll just briefly cover kind of some of the risks in this approach, and then we can kind of pick up for questions. So, I mean, I want to be clear, like, this is not, we don't have some silver bullet for this conflict, right? I think you can see that these are modest changes from what's already going on. In some cases, they are they're significant thresholds when we talk about things like potentially opening the door to going around the Iraqi government to support Sunnis in Iraq, or opening the door to something like a no-fly zone in Syria, where we would potentially be taking direct strikes against the Assad regime, as well as more support to more acceptable, less extremist, the term moderate is tricky, but opposition groups in Syria. Those are all modest changes, but they are significant ones that the administration has been reluctant to do so far. There are a couple of risks with this approach. One is this does deepen U.S. military involvement in the region in a number of different ways, puts more U.S. troops at risk in terms of their role of advisors. And something like a no-bombing zone runs the risk of escalation with Russia and Syria, and would, if Russia and Syria didn't comply with the no-bombing zone, the response would be direct U.S. strikes against the Assad regime. This is not, wholesale U.S. military involvement to occupy these territories, to take out the Assad regime, to own this. This is not an occupation force. But it deepens its involvement in significant ways. I think we point out that when it comes to sort of a deeper military role. For one, when it comes to things like risk of escalation with Russia, Russia doesn't want a direct conflict with us either. We're going to need to, and we have a long history with Russia before the Soviet Union of balancing, military operations in different places and avoiding conflicts spiraling out of control. Secondly, when it comes to sort of the increased risk of U.S. military operations, like there are risks to letting ISIS sit and fester. There are risks to moving too quickly or supporting the wrong groups and then exacerbating tensions on the ground. So I think it's about trading off, balancing these risks in different ways.
Well, I mean, a couple of other risks. One is, and I mentioned this earlier, even if you effectively take all this territory and reshape the situation on the ground, you might just never get to a political agreement. And I think that's a risk worth taking. Or these countries might break up, because what we're talking about here is, arming more local groups on the ground, which pulls you away from the unity of these countries towards potentially more separation. But we would argue that that risk is less problematic than allowing these situations to fester. And as we've seen from the previous replay in Iraq, if we are just going to try to put an artificial central government on top of these conflicts that doesn't actually reflect the needs of the local population, they're going to rebel in some kind of form. You'll just end up with ISIS 3.0. You had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now you have ISIS, and part of the challenge, especially in Iraq, is the Shia have the Shia militia and the Iraqi security forces. The Kurds have the Kurdish Peshmerga. The Sunnis, what is their leverage? Well, right now their leverage is ISIS, because nobody's given them any other leverage. And so you need to create an alternative which gives them security leverage in negotiations. So I think it's a risk worth taking. And finally, the other real risk is that we're only talking about Iraq and Syria here. You're still going to have problems globally. You're still going to have to deal with issues in Libya. You're still going to have to deal with ISIS's transnational threat network, Europe, United States, homegrown threats. So you have to do all those things as well and manage that in the long term. But we think that this is the core, as I said earlier, the center of gravity of the conflict. And so this is what you really want to focus on. Just to conclude, the reality is we've been struggling with this problem since 9/11. Right? This how to deal with safe havens and how to terrorize the safe havens and security vacuums. And our initial approach right after 9/11, say the Bush administration approach, was go heavy, counterinsurgency, 150,000 troops on the ground. It didn't work. It was too costly, and it was not sustainable politically in the United States. And you had the reverse approach, I'd argue, from 2009 to 2014. We were really trying to pull out and put almost no forces on the ground whatsoever. And we had that in Iraq, we had that in Libya, also didn't work. We found, so what we're arguing here for is what we think is a policy that can be applied not just in Iraq and Syria, but globally, where limited numbers of Americans with certain American military investment, proportional to our interests, sustainable in the long term, it can actually deal with these problems. And we think that this can be a model for doing that at a cost that is reasonable, not outrageous and disproportionate to dealing with other problems like China and Russia, but also not trying to walk away from this altogether, which we found we can't do. And I think, I'd argue in the last 2 years, slowly but surely, that's what the Obama administration has been stumbling into here in the Middle East. And the question is really for the next president, can they take that, articulate it, solidify it, and turn it into something we can work on? So we'll stop there and take questions.
Great presentation, and you really, laid out the three-dimensional chessboard. That multiple parties playing by different rules, and it's very complex. What strikes me, though, and you present great ideas that have merit and logic. The question is, how do you manage this? How do you do the strategy? How do you, when you've got the Turks, the Russians, multiple, acceptable, rebel forces, and so how do you really, how do you execute a strategy when you have no control over, multiple players here? And it seems like you've got to get a lot of buy-in from different groups, and so a very practical or technical question. So, who's in charge? Who manages it? And how do you really execute this? And over time, because once you do one, it's like, pushing on the balloon in one area, things are going to happen in other areas. So really, I mean, is this a military operation from the United States? Is it, diplomatic? Is it, who really synchronizes this, and who really has the rose pinned on them to work with all these different entities, and then have the authority to make changes, adjustments, so that, because I really get the picture, we've really got to be agile and flexible and be able to to create opportunities or exploit opportunities as they come, but deal with real complex problems that will continue to emerge from this. So who's in charge, and how do we really execute this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this problem of synchronizing our political and military efforts, and more broadly, like translating military actions to political effects, is one we've been struggling with the last 15 years. This translation of military power to political effects is just a very challenging one, period, right? Not unique to us. There's, I think one of the things that we'd argue we could do better is to thinking more about the political first, right? And then make sure that that's flowing into things. Like, I'll just give a narrow example, right? There was this incident several months ago where a bunch of U.S. Special Forces troops in northern Syria were photographed with YPG patches on their arms.
And the Canadians as well.
Right, and so like, I was a ranger. I get why they're doing this. They're participating alongside these troops. They're trying to sort of show like solidarity with them, and like, I'm one of you. But like, the political implications of that are just really ugly. Turkey views the YPG as basically terrorism, right? And so that part of that's making sure that things are accurately communicated to people on the ground, but also putting the politics first. Organizationally, that's a tough challenge in the government. I mean, I don't have like some magic solution for how to make like the interagency process more effective. Although CNAS does have a report on that. So as part of we're doing a series of, this is part of a series of sort of things, setting the agenda for the next president. And there's one on NSC reform, which is always a hot topic and a fun topic.
Just to add one thing on that, I think in terms of the international response and coordinating all those pieces, there's a moment for a new administration when it first comes in where you have that opening. If you hit the ground running effectively to get a lot of buy-in early on, you have this wiggle room. And I think one of the benefits that, so I can't speculate on what Trump would do necessarily, but like thinking from a Clinton perspective at least, as somebody who's got the level of experience that she has, like, you're not going to have a relatively smooth handover from Obama. You can get the benefits that come from an early wave of goodwill internationally and an openness to people who want to work with the new president for 8 years, without all the with less of the discombobulation that comes from transitions, because you have a whole new team who's inexperienced. And so there's a moment there early on, especially in the Middle East, where, for numerous reasons, some of which I blame our administration for, some of which I blame our Middle Eastern friends for, President is not that popular, even though in many ways a lot of the policies he's pursued are things they'd want him to pursue, and with some small shifts both in how we approach it. I guess the way I would describe it is actually the Middle East in many ways views Obama the way Europe did Bush between 2006 and 2008. Bush's policy was actually much more realist and reasonable and appealing to the Europeans during that time frame, but they were pretty much done with him. And we're looking beyond him and so frustrated with the Iraq War. Obama has this challenge with a lot of our Middle Eastern partners right now who hate the Iran deal and other things like that. But the policies are actually moving in the right direction where they'd want it to be. So Clinton, for example, could come in very early on and with some slight shifts in tone and some slight changes in policy, like the types of things we're talking about, pick up a lot of early goodwill from these countries who are looking for somebody else. And so I think there's an opportunity there too. Let's go in the back.
Yeah, so I find your comment interesting. You said we should think about the political aspect first. And by you guys' own admission, some of the policy changes that you're recommending may not include a political solution at the end of the day that ends with a recognizable Syria and Iraq or even recognizable governing entities. So my question to you would be, what makes you think that any of these smaller local bodies will be able to effectively govern any better than ISIS or any of the other larger groups that we potentially don't see as acceptable?
Well, I think govern effect. What do we mean by govern effectively, right? Like, I mean, I'm interested in groups that are not going to support terrorism, right? ISIS obviously has a different view of what effectively govern means, right? How effective does it need to be? It doesn't need to be, effective from my standpoint. It needs to be effective enough that the local population accepts them, that they have security, that they can resist another extremist group like ISIS from coming back. And that's it. That's good enough. I mean, I think, we've I think it's correct to say putting politics first. The question is, what is the political settlement you want to achieve? In any war, you should be thinking about, like, what does peace look like? What's the peace I'm trying to achieve, right? And it's more than just about destroying or anyone destroying the actor. Like, what do I want to replace them? We don't always do a good job of that. We didn't really think a lot when we went into Iraq about, like, what happens after Saddam, right? In this case, I would say that, like, Syria and Iraq staying whole, that's good, that's ideal. That's not the core thing. The core thing is there's something that replaces this gray. There's something there that's sustainable to the local population. It doesn't matter that they, if that's fractured, if that's decentralized, that's okay, as long as they can resist more extremist groups.
Yeah, and we've done a lot in terms of investing in some, well, I mean, you have some examples here. The Kurdish regional government in Iraq is doing pretty well. This area is doing pretty well. It's about who has the security power, but it's also about who has legitimacy, right? And legitimacy from the local population. Because the security forces are taken from the local population, there's a much higher probability that they're going to be able to at least govern sufficiently. If you provide them also with things like support for local councils, which they're building in some cases, in areas. So, it's not ideal, but it's the type of model that's also worked in places like the Balkans and things like that. You go over here.
Yeah, so I guess then the end state, what you're saying is a bunch of very small regional groups, locally acceptable populations, but is that contingent on both Iraq and Syria, the states themselves actually accepting somewhat, federated countries, kind of like with Kurdistan? And then would that be ripe for sectarian violence, such as with PMF, after ISIS is done with, who's going to say that PMF aren't going to go crazy in northern Iraq or wherever else?
So I think one important thing that you're trying to do with these is, and I think you're right, that is the end state we're sort of talking about. You're not just trying to get local, you're starting with the model that's worked in some of these places. You start with almost local city type forces that then come together under coalitions that are more regional. So that you're not talking about 1,000 different colors, you're talking about 5 or 6 different colors, which is, I think, much easier and more manageable. That's what's happened here. Southern Front is something like 40 different local organizations that have all come together. The total, this is 34 different groups. I mean, so there's, that's the type of model that you're talking about. I don't think it eliminates the possibility of sectarian violence, but the idea is over time, if these populations feel like they're being governed by groups that represent them, and their security is being provided for by people who represent them, they're less likely to fight. You talk to Kurds. We had Masoud Barzani at our center a year ago now, president of the KRG. And he said, Kurds don't want to go here. We don't really want to be all that much part of the Mosul offensive. Like, not our area. We do care a lot about Kirkuk, which is we have these flash points and flash locations, but for the most part, I think Aleppo would be another major flash location. But in some ways, if you can get acceptable groups governing these areas, you're going to eliminate a lot of that conflict.
I don't think there's anything that we're proposing that resolves those risks and problems, right? Like, there's nothing here that's going to make these sectarian conflicts go away. They're long-standing. They'll be here generations from now. There's nothing that necessarily is going to make a sectarian compromise happen in Iraq or a peace deal in Syria. I think what we'd say is that building up an alternative to ISIS and extremist groups in both countries is better directly from a counterterrorism perspective, and in the long run, probably more conducive to a peaceful settlement. Increases the chances. How are we going to prevent Shia militias from rampaging through Sunni areas and murdering people? Well, if there are no local Sunni forces, there's no one to stop them. the only person to stop them is ISIS, right? That dynamic drives Sunnis right into the arms of ISIS. If there's at least some kind of alternative, some sort of more moderate alternative, there's at least some counterbalancing effect at play.
Back.
Earlier you had mentioned the fourth line of effort being the diplomacy and negotiations sort of track, and that probably hasn't gone as successful as the administration of the last 2 years on dealing with other actors who are tough to negotiate with. And I guess I want to see your perspective on are there any sort of sticking points in these ongoing negotiations that the administration needs to either sort of be more flexible on or just sort of forget about entirely, and alternatively, do you think there's any sort of means of diplomatic pressure that they can bring to bear on the opposite side that they've been reluctant to so far you think they should be using?
So I would maybe say two things. One area where we should be more flexible and one area where we should bring more pressure to bear. Where we should bring more pressure to bear, I think the Russians and the Iranians and the Assad regime know that the US has pretty much said, we're not going to do anything militarily here in Western Syria. So we have this agreement of cessation of hostilities. Nobody's going to bomb in these different areas. And the Russians just violate it on a daily basis, and there is no consequence. So this report actually came out the day after the State Department memo signed by 51 diplomats saying you need to, what we're arguing for, a no bombing zone, is not all that different than saying there need to just be military consequences if you violate agreements on where you're going to bomb and not bomb. This is all these guys need to see, I think, that you can't just negotiate and then continue to do whatever you want on the battlefield. There are consequences when you don't live up to your word. So the question is, are there military options that you can deploy that don't suck us in too deeply and aren't too escalatory, that can catch people's attention? And again, I think here there's a benefit of a new administration coming in, because I think the Russians and the Iranians and others have calculated at this point that President Obama's not going to do that. So if President Obama were to threaten that, they would absolutely test it, and you have to force a response or no response. But a new administration comes in, they don't have a read on the new president yet necessarily, who can make that statement, probably has a better chance of being able to create deterrence and then cause some recalculation. The thing that I would say we should not ever have done, and we need to walk back from in some ways, we don't need to be out there saying Assad must go. That was a mistake. I don't think Assad cannot retake all this territory, okay? And when the Russians and Assad try to go into Aleppo, all they're doing is fueling a fire. He doesn't have the capacity to retake that. He doesn't have the manpower. He doesn't have the ability to retake that. But I have no problem with him holding a lot of this red area over here that hasn't really been fought over as much, or that the regime clearly, credibly controls. And so being wedded to him leaving, I think, is a problem. What you do need to have is, what we should care about is a political arrangement that's actually sustainable and works for the local actors. I have a hard time seeing how Bashar al-Assad is able to remain in the long term. That's up to them to decide and us to put in place the conditions that can help them decide. And I would love nothing more than 15 years from now to see him, like Slobodan Milosevic style, sitting at The Hague being tried for war crimes, because that's what he is. But it doesn't mean that that's what we need to be pushing for today. We want to end the fighting. So that would be an example. I mean, the type of diplomatic negotiation I would like to see would be if we come in and are more serious and actually willing to threaten military force, and we say to the Russians, let's divide this territory up. It's pretty natural, okay? You can, keep Assad in power in these areas, and maybe we can talk about some of these little smaller ones. Let us work with the Turks and moderate opposition groups here to try to consolidate Aleppo and Idlib in that area. And then you can actually start to see a map that makes sense. And Russians, you get Assad to pull back from here, and in exchange, we're not going to threaten Damascus, and we're going to get these groups to sort of pull back. That seems to me like the type of thing you can do. But if you were to sort of negotiate that right now, the Russians would say, okay, yes. And the next day, they would just continue to do what they're doing, because that's what they've been doing, because there's no consequence. Over here.
Yeah, I agree with your strategy, but I still feel it's a bit difficult how to implement it. Especially I looked much at the Safwa, the Anbar awakening, and the key there was of course the kind of mutual relationship that was established between local tribal leaders and American officers. And I've got a lot of tea drinking to, to establish that relationship. And also of course there are a lot of political costs for for some of these forces to cooperate with the US forces. And so some recent polls indicate a little support or trust in US forces in these countries. And of course, there are Islamic states are very, particularly brutal against Sunni Arabs who are cooperating with the United States or of course with other enemies. So the point is, how do you get to convince those Sunni Arabs or other local actors to cooperate with the US forces without, based on only with a moderate level of support to them?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a frequent, in our sort of rollout and engage with a number of folks in the government and the Hill and West on this is a frequent concern that people raise, and I think it's super legitimate, which is like, okay, I agree with the idea of supporting more Sunni Arabs. How do I do that? That's really hard. Like, who are these people? Where do I find them? How do I make these connections? Yeah, during the Sunni awakening, I mean, you had the benefit of, you could have a battalion of Marines that could come alongside some of these tribal groups that rose up against Al-Qaeda, and you could provide them a security. And you're not going to have that level of US commitment. I don't think we should be back in that capacity. Having said that, there are things that we could do to better support groups on the ground. Once we find folks like, for example, the new Syrian Army, right? We could give money, we could give weapons, we could send in US advisors, we could deploy US air power, support them. So I think there are ways that we can help bolster these groups. It's not going to be the same level of security commitment that you saw during the awakening. This is the inevitable, sort of effect of that is it's a little bit of a slower approach in terms of, rolling back ISIS.
One of the outstanding problems that I didn't really hear addressed so far is the refugees. So there's, I think you said 11 million refugees, or at least in the report, that are displaced either within Syria or abroad. Even if you can secure those territories with local leaders, what do you do about all the people who fled and are no longer there in various camps throughout Syria?
That's a good question. There were a lot of things. Originally, we wanted to sort of tackle this broader dimension of ISIS outside of this theater. And there are a lot of things that we sort of set outside the scope of the report to make it manageable. There's obviously issues in Libya and Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first concept is if you can stop the fighting, a fair amount of people will come back. But obviously there needs to be much more done in terms of letting Syrian refugees into the United States, across the globe, much more done to support them in Turkey, in Jordan, Lebanon. We're doing a lot, but I think we could be doing a lot more, and we should be doing more. I mean, the White House was celebrating 10,000 the other day. It's a drop in the bucket. And if you're going to lead, then you're going to sort of put yourself out there as the moral authorities and global leaders, then you've got to actually be able to do more. It's pretty tough in this political environment, obviously. But yeah, I guess I'd argue this doesn't solve that problem, but stopping the fighting stops it from getting worse, and then you can actually start to address it. You got to get a tourniquet on the actual fighting first. And so that's step one, while you're trying to do everything you can on the humanitarian front.
So this, what you've described looks like an extension of the existing model, from my perspective, with more guns and more troops, more U.S. commitment. What if you changed the entire framework and said, the problem is guns and peak personnel, and you try to stop or stem the flow of weapons into those organizations? And how much time and effort and energy have we done to do that?
Which organizations? We're talking about the ones, all of them, or
everything. So is there a potential way to shut off or shut down or reduce the amount of weaponry that's flowing into that region, that's basically being used to fuel the multiple conflicts?
Well, I think you can. We're trying to do that at least with ISIS. Shutting down the Manbij pocket will make a huge difference in that. We've worked with the Jordanians a lot on controlling what goes in the south. But I think at the end of the day, there's two reasons why you can't. I would argue against it. One is you don't want the current balance of power, and like this map, if you stop the guns and just said let's freeze it like this, not an acceptable outcome for us, right? We still have these gray, and so you have to continue to try to shift the balance of power. And two, and equally importantly, also not an acceptable outcome for the Saudis, the Turks, the Qataris, the Russians, or I don't know about the Russians, but a lot of the Iranians, a lot of these other countries who are going to continue to send weapons in. So even if we shut it down, if we have a policy our partners aren't on board with, it's never going to, I don't think you can do it. Because that's been part of the problem thus far, is they don't think, especially we're taking the problem in Western Syria seriously enough and are going to do enough, and so they're all dumping their own weapons and proxies, and that's only making things worse. So what we're arguing for is at least if you can get everybody on the same page, you can have weapons only going to one side, or at least two sides that are more appealing, and you can over time shift the balance of power. That's what I would argue.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two things that we could do now that would, I think, help things that we're recommending. One is to close this gap up here, which is the Manbij offensive, not the Turkey offensive, is to do that, to cut off ISIS supply lines. And the second one is to consolidate our partners in the region to get them more on the same sheet of music in terms of who they're supporting. But I mean, you know, how are you going to convince? You're going to convince Iran and Russia to stop supporting the Assad regime? Like, how does that? What's our leverage to make that happen, right? Other than sort of changing events on the ground and working towards a cessation of hostilities that's actually enforced. And you know, to a large extent, like as Ilan said, like our partners in the region have been supporting groups that maybe we would prefer they not do, in part because we've stepped back and haven't been as engaged. And so they said, well, we're going to take matters into their own hands. And they have, even if they're, you know, even if the partners are over this, they still have divergent interests. For many of them, ISIS is a problem, Iranian influence is a bigger problem. And so they're willing to support whoever they need to push back against Assad.
So I've often felt that one of our major problems in trying to develop a strategy for this region is that there's a disconnect between our stated priorities and how much resources we're putting into things. So administrations often say fighting terrorism is one of their top foreign policy priorities, and yet we're not willing to put the resources into doing it, which may be the right response and it may not be. But how do we deal with that disconnect? And on top of that, the Obama administration tried to shift away from dealing with the police and was sucked back in. So even if it's not the stated priority of the administration, they spend most of their time dealing with it. Is that something we can fix with a different messaging strategy at home, or a different rethinking of what our priorities ought to be?
Well, this is where I'd argue what we're trying to pitch, beyond just Iraq and Syria, is an overall strategy and approach that gets that. You know, something that's, the key word is sustainability. What is a sustainable approach that doesn't absorb? I mean, the White House right now at the NSC, they're spending so much more time on this than on almost anything else, and that's probably not good. Like, I would actually argue on the terrorism balance front, we're spending too much time on terrorism relative to the actual threat. Russia, China, I mean, these are the big issues of the 21st century that we have to deal with, especially China. But the problem is, this becomes a huge political issue, right? One attack just has disproportionate political effects here in this country, and so you need to be able to actually manage it and have a serious, credible long-term strategy, and we've been groping in the dark for 15 years. If you had a doctrine, if you actually had an approach that said, here's how we deal with these problems, we work with local groups on the ground, we give limited necessary military support of this type, depending on what's needed, we try to organize external actors, we look for political solutions. That's a cookie cutter, but it's a starting point from which you then have to apply very different solutions to, you can actually start to explain that to the public, you can start to explain that to yourself, you can start to explain that to the military and the intelligence community and the people who are, and you can maybe try to get to, over time, what is a sustainable, durable approach to dealing with these problems that doesn't require the president to sign off on everything. And you can get back to spending more time on some of these other challenges.
Yeah, and I think we see this model that's been unfolding the last few years as a better, more sustainable approach than the occupied countries or the sort of pull back and drone strikes model. But I think there's this broader question of stepping aside even from Iraq and Syria of like, how big of a threat is terrorism and how much are you willing to expend, how many resources, whatever, to buy down that risk and what's acceptable. And that's a really tough conversation to have. Terrorism seems to lend itself to a lot of hyperbole. You have people on the one hand that are like, it's an existential threat. No, it's ridiculous. Like, none of the national security challenges the United States faces, here, Russia, and China, are existential threats to the United States, with the exception of the remaining Soviet nuclear arsenal in Russia. That is the only thing that threatens the existence of the country. Everything else is, like, on that scale, like, not a big deal. But, like, you know, the American public, I don't think, would find allowing terrorism threats on the scale of 9/11 certainly acceptable, right? On the other hand, we can't stop some maniac from walking into a crowded place and shooting a bunch of people up, whether he's yelling Allah Akbar or whatever, right? That's just the reality of the world we live in today. And so, you know, I actually think that the American public is really prudent about these threats. You know, when you look at like the Boston Marathon bombings, what happened in San Bernardino, you don't see this major backlash of the American public saying, oh my God, what's happened? Our government has failed us, we need to go invade some country. But it's hard for policymakers to say this, and people are going to use this as a political cudgel in Washington to say, oh, you're weak on terrorism, or you don't say Islamic terrorism, I don't know, whatever the latest thing is. But that's a challenging thing to figure out, like, what's the amount at which we want to buy down that risk? Particularly when there's just a lot of uncertainty, you know, of like, it's not like we have perfect insight into the capacities of what's going on, planning of various groups inside this safe haven or Yemen or elsewhere. You see similar arguments unfold in things like drone strikes, of like how expansive should we be in terms of who we target. Like, you're having policymakers make these calls about where to draw the line, but also on occasions of a lot of uncertainty in terms of what they actually know.
I just want to ask a question about the Kurds and the Turkish government. And you guys have kind of already touched on this a little bit, so I don't know if you have a lot to add. But you mentioned earlier sort of the situation in Iraq with us trying to decide whether we deal directly with the government, sort of do an end around and deal with these smaller groups. And I'm wondering if, are we sort of facing the same thing with Turkey and Kurds, where we're trying to sort of do both of them without annoying the other? So that's the first part. And then I guess just the second part of the question is, you talk about the Kurdish group going into Manbij and sort of how we told the Turks, don't worry, that they're going to leave eventually. And I'm just wondering kind of what the plan was there. If the plan was for the Kurds to kind of clear the area out and then hopefully hand it over to another group. And if that was the plan, again, it seems like a maybe not great thing for us to say to the Turks, because we can't really control the Kurds, even if we think we're working with them. So, I don't know, there might not be answers to that. That's kind of just what we're about.
No, it's basically dive another layer into this whole Kurdish-Turkish mess. So the groups, the light blue, we call that group the Syrian Democratic Front, which is, and which we say is a multi-ethnic group which has a lot of Kurds in it, but also some Arabs and other organizations that we're trying to stay with. In reality, most of the fighters in the Syrian Democratic Front are members of the YPG, a Kurdish organization, basically who is the sister organization of the PKK. So when the Turks say these guys are terrorists, you can see how the Turks would think that. And when you go into, you hear pretty amusing stories about American officials going into these parts of northern Syria lately, and they walk into a building and there's a big picture of Abdullah Öcalan on there, and they're like, you should take that one down. So this is real. The thought process behind Manbij was, we have these other Arab groups that we sort of tried to staple on to the Syrian Democratic Forces. The Kurds can help lead the offensive, but it would ultimately be some local Arab tribes that will, who will stay and govern and be part of that security and governance structure afterwards. But the reality is these local Arab groups, at least according to reporting on the ground, had almost zero credibility with the local population. And we're seeing this stooges of the Kurds because they were, and they reported directly to the Kurds. So this is total fiction that you could actually make this work. Which is why what we are doing now is we're saying, get back beyond the Euphrates. I think our government recognizes that the Turks taking this territory, coordinated with a number of moderate, I'd say acceptable armed opposition groups, and maybe some that are not so acceptable, quite frankly, that the Kurd Turks are working with, is a much more sustainable option for sealing up this area now that they're in than working with the Kurds.
But I don't think, to your question, I don't think that what's unfolded was part of like the American plan, right? Like if it looks like, wow, this is a really terrible plan, it's like, yeah, I don't think this was anybody's plan. It's that, you know, Turkey decided they had enough and they were going to take action, and you gotta react.
Well, it's classic. There's a great Wall Street Journal article, and classic sort of. If you talk to people, the administration is basically. We've been asking them to do this for a year and a half. We've been talking about doing this operation. They called us up last week and said, and told the Pentagon, we want to go. The Pentagon asked the White House. The White House said, let us think about it. There was a high-level White House meeting scheduled for that day to talk about it. In the morning, the news comes on. Turkey is going into northern Syria. And then our military, CENTCOM commanders were like, well, we're providing air support. And sort of started that operation. But I think the alternative, if we waited, would have been having American special operators going in on the ground with the Turks, which would have made it better, because we would have had eyes, which would have given us a much better ability to then be able to deconflict between the Turks and the Kurds, and more leverage there. And with a little more of a heads up, we could have given a more serious, probably put this, the thumb to the Kurds more squarely and said, you got to get out of here, the Turks are coming. But yeah, classic sort of, getting back to, I think that goes back to your question of how you manage this entire mess. That's a classic example.
So assuming that, this is sort of a longer term question, but assuming that you end up without, Iraq and Syria staying whole and you end up with more federated states, how do you, and also operating under the assumption, which I think is true, that you can't kill your way out of ISIS, that there will be members of ISIS and the lesser discussed, but Al-Qaeda affiliate that continue to exist in the area. How do you sort of envision communication being facilitated between these different states and cooperation occurring and sort of preventing a relapse into whether it's more ethnic conflict or civil war in Western Syria, and sort of how do you envision that communication taking place and then also preventing terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda resurfacing along the cracks in those states?
So I think on the I think the model that we're hoping for and arguing for is not actually having these states be separate, but having, Iraq be the same on the map, but a lot of the governance and power is then in these three separate sort of regions, essentially. And they're negotiating, which sometimes can basically have a balance of forces that then leads to political outcome. And it would look not all that different than the relationship between the Shia and the Kurds right now in Iraq, which is problematic and difficult and all kinds of negotiations and things that they do to sort of screw each other. They're fighting over oil revenues, they're fighting over who has control of Kirkuk. They're not going to war with each other, right? And it's reflective of, first you have a balance of forces, then you can sort of get to essentially a political stalemate.
Yeah, I think my question was, sorry, I should have said this, but I think more in relation to Syria, because it's more the buy-in in, if you assume that Assad continues to hold power, or some entity affiliated with Assad continues to hold power, there's not a lot of trust there with the Syrian people for good reason. So how do you sort of maintain that?
I think Syria becomes a lot like Iraq or like Lebanon. It's another good example. These are relatively dysfunctional states that are governed in a highly sectarian, sort of divided way, but because of the balance of forces, they're both better off right now than Syria is, and that's probably the best you're going to do. On the question, you won't eliminate ISIS and Al-Qaeda. You'll basically drive them back to being terrorist networks as opposed to being states, or as opposed to holding and governing territory. So you're still going to have to just continue to deal with that extremism problem and those possibility, but at least if there's good, acceptable governance and control of this territory, you can stop them from retaking territory and keep them more at that level beyond that, which is less of a threat to us because it doesn't give them the same capacity and space with which to organize and plan sort of high-level catastrophic attacks externally, which is what you're most concerned about.
I think we've come to, there's one more question? Go
Yeah,
ahead. Okay.
last question. I have two questions for you. And,
I did two questions.
they're connected. So I see a clear what in your framework, I see some skepticism in the how, money, special forces, boots on the ground. What I don't see is a clear why. And what I see is that answering that question is crucial to bring together the people, the government, and the military, and also the regional actors that we have in the Middle East. So my question is, why are we doing this? Are we doing this for U.S. interests? Are we doing this for the Middle East? Are we doing this because we regret that we did before? So that's the first question. And connected to that one will be the fact that how effective is approaching this issue from an offshore balancing perspective? Haven't we learned that dealing with the Middle East in that way is not effective enough? So how would you answer those questions?
Yeah, and I think the why is that, this safe haven for terrorism, which is not acceptable to U.S. interests. We've been trying since 9/11 to sort of close these safe havens. It's hard. Terrorist groups move around. There's a lot of messy, unstable regions across North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia for them to find places to find safe haven. But here you see now in ISIS the first real sort of proto-state forming, and that's a really serious problem. And so shrinking that territory is really essential. I think to mitigating, the risk of this safe haven being used for immediate attacks against Europe and the United States, certainly the destabilizing effects on the region, neighboring countries, on refugee flows in Europe, but also as a sort of a recruiting tool for ISIS, and they've done a pretty good job, really, of sort of leveraging this for sort of a messaging propaganda standpoint. In terms of the offshore, I don't know. I don't think about, I guess, U.S. policy in that. I understand the concept, but I don't really think about it in that way.
Let me do that. Let me take that. One other thing I'll just say on why, just to double down on Paul's point on the refugees. I mean, when the refugees crisis starts to undermine the wholeness of the European Union, that becomes a major issue for the United States in terms of our long-term allies, long-term strategic, partners. And it's having that effect. So that, combined with the threat from terrorism, combined with the reality that you're never going to get this right, I think, unless you do it this way. If we just focus on ISIS, we're never going to get all the external actors to come on board because they all have their other interests. So you need an approach that's actually going to get everybody in the region to actually work with you, or at least accept what you're doing and take it seriously. Which then gets to our interests. In terms of offshore balance, what I would say is, we were basically an offshore balancer through, I would call this offshore balancing. We were essentially probably an offshore balancer. It's complicated, but things changed in 2003. Let's just put it that way, when we invaded Iraq, certainly. And since then we've been, we were very deeply engaged, over-engaged in the Middle East. We tried pulling back, probably to a level that I would argue is even less than we were before 1991. I think that's where President Obama was trying to take us. I think that's where he'd like to have taken us. But it also didn't work. And so we are going to have to strike this balance, right? We want to pivot to Asia. We want to deal with a more aggressive Russia and supporting our NATO allies. We can't be bogged down in this region spending all of our time and all of our money and all of our efforts on this while other issues get short shrift. But we've also found that we can't leave it alone, because when we do, it just messy, ugly things start coming out of there that become hugely problematic and destabilizing. And so, what we're arguing for here is sort of what we think is something that can actually be middle ground and sustainable. That can actually, if you were to tell me 0 troops in Iraq, just my instinct, just pure instinct, this isn't about, just take it to very 0 troops in Iraq, given American interests, doesn't seem right to me. 150,000 troops in Iraq, given American interests, also doesn't seem right to me. But there is somewhere there which is right. There are interests to protect. They're just not interests to protect at that level. And so that's sort of how I think about our long-term engagement in the region.
Yeah, because I know you guys are all in school, so I'll make sort of an academic point, I guess, that may be useful. I just say, I don't know that I find the concept of offshore balancing useful thinking about foreign policy from a terrorism standpoint. I'm sure you guys probably people read on those things, but to me, it's an interesting concept historically, thinking about great power conflict. It may be a useful way to describe U.S. relations in Europe and Asia in terms of great power conflict against Russia and China. But I just don't know that I'm not sure how that paradigm fits when thinking about terrorism. And I think, maybe there's some analogies in terms of what we're trying to do is assist partners in the region versus trying to do it ourselves, and maybe you can say it's analogous. But to me, it's a different thing. And anyway, in any case, like to me, one of the lessons of 9/11 is that our oceans don't protect us, right? Like that's not, that concept that oceans protect us from great power wars and so we can engage elsewhere in a limited way, that makes sense when you think about like great power conflict, maybe in an era before ICBMs. It certainly doesn't make sense to me against terrorism. I don't even know if it makes sense against, you know, modern sort of global warfare anyway. So I just don't, I don't know. It's not something that, it's not a term that I would normally use. But.
Well, we've come to the end of our normal time here. I think everyone would join me in saying thank you for a great presentation. You have certainly given us a tremendous amount to think about and maybe even depressed us a little bit. But no, on a serious note, I mean, this is a complex problem. And a couple of your points there, you know, you mentioned China, Russia, all the other things. I mean, I think, you know, even if this was the main effort, you know, even if we were to make this the #1 priority, which I don't think it is, it's going to be damn hard to really, you know, I hesitate to say solve the problem, but to bring things to a manageable level. And but I do have to say that some of the things you laid out really is great food for thought. And you know, 0 and 150,000, that range there. I mean, that's part of the problem. And you've done a great job in laying out the issues for us. So, on behalf of our program, we'd like to present you with our coin, which says Theory, Policy, Scholarship, and Practice. And I think you know what you've really done here is showed us theory, a lot of policy, backed up with scholarship, and it's going to be up to people on the ground putting things into practice. So please join me in thanking